It was early morning at the international airport. A warm amber glow from the overhead lights bathed the luxurious rows of first-class seats. A black woman, dressed in a sharp gray suit, stepped quietly into seat 2A. Her posture was confident, composed, and grounded. Without fuss, she opened her laptop, tucked her slim backpack neatly beneath her feet, and prepared for a long but important flight. Minutes later, a flight attendant approached. She smiled politely, but her eyes were cold. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone polite but edged. "This seat has been reserved for our VIP passenger. I'm going to have to ask you to move to the main cabin." Behind her stood a white woman wearing designer sunglasses, tapping her diamond-studded watch impatiently. "I always sit here," she said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This is my seat." The black woman simply looked up. No anger, no protest. Calmly, she pulled out her platinum membership card and her boarding pass, clearly marked 2A. "I booked this seat," she said. "I'm a priority member. This is my assigned seat." But just minutes later, the entire first-class cabin fell into an uneasy silence. The unthinkable had happened. The woman was asked to leave, escorted off the plane, treated as though she didn't belong, because of how she looked, not because of who she was. What the crew didn't know was that they had just disrespected the CEO of a company currently in talks to acquire shares in their airline. And within the next 5 minutes, the balance of power would shift dramatically. This wouldn't end with an apology. It would end with 3 careers lost, a corporate crisis, and a lesson no one would forget about pride, dignity, and truth. Her name was Celeste Howard. She was 45 years old. She wasn't loud. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't the type to demand attention or flaunt success. Celeste lived quietly, deliberately. Every step she took was thoughtful. Every word measured and composed. That morning, she was on the 7:20 a.m. flight from New York to San Francisco to speak as the keynote guest at the International Ethics and Technology Conference. Celeste was the CEO of Ethical Mind, a tech firm valued at over $3.2 billion, specializing in artificial intelligence and bias-free decision systems. Her company's software helped organizations, from banks to hospitals to airlines, eliminate discrimination and implicit bias from customer service. She knew the patterns of bias better than anyone, because for much of her life, she had been on the receiving end of them. What she didn't expect was that, on this very day, she would not just speak about bias, she would live through it, not as an expert, but as its target. She chose Novajet Airlines for its highly rated first-class cabin. It offered quiet seating, wide legroom, and a professional atmosphere, ideal for reviewing her keynote presentation. Celeste had booked her seat 2 weeks in advance. She had selected 2A on purpose, a window seat in the front row with extra legroom and easy access. As a platinum member, the check-in process was seamless, as always. But just as she settled into her seat, opened her laptop, and began typing her opening lines, a voice interrupted her. "Excuse me, ma'am," said a soft voice with a distinctly hard undertone. "There appears to be a mix-up. This seat is reserved today for one of our VIP guests. I'll need you to move." Celeste looked up. Standing in front of her was a flight attendant named Lisa, her uniform crisp, her posture professional, but her eyes told a different story. They didn't scan the boarding pass. They didn't look at the platinum card. They just looked at her skin. Behind Lisa stood the white woman again, this time arms crossed, silk cream dress, Chanel bag on one shoulder. Her expression was clear, impatience disguised as entitlement. "I always sit here," she said flatly. "Every flight, this is my preferred seat." Lisa turned to Celeste. She didn't say it out loud, but the message was unmistakable. Between the unknown black woman and the familiar white VIP, the crew had already picked a side. Celeste remained composed. She took out her ID, her platinum card, and opened the e-boarding pass on her phone. It all read the same, Seat 2A. "This is my assigned seat," she said softly, "and I have all the documentation to prove that." Lisa nodded, her lips tight, but she wasn't backing down. "I understand," she said. "However, this guest is a longtime client who always sits here. We thought you might be more comfortable in another seat." Celeste paused. "You think I'd be more comfortable elsewhere? Because she wants this one?" Her voice stayed calm, but the air shifted. Nearby passengers began to notice. Phones were slowly raised. They'd seen this script before. A person of color treated differently, polite words, discriminatory actions. "I'm sorry," Lisa said again, firmer this time, "but we really need your cooperation." "No," Celeste replied simply. "I chose this seat because I need the space to work. I'm not giving it up because someone else wants it. I paid for it. That's the policy." Silence fell over first class. Even the engine seemed to hush. Then it happened. Samantha, the woman standing nearby, casually slipped a folded stack of bills into Lisa's pocket, smooth and discreet, like handing off a thank you gift. "Thanks for helping me get back my usual seat," she whispered, barely audible, if not for a passenger filming nearby. And in that moment, Celeste realized this wasn't about a seat anymore. This was a test of dignity. About 5 minutes later, a man in a flight operations uniform approached. He walked with the confidence of someone used to being in charge. His name was Tony Harris, and his serious expression matched the clipboard he carried. "Good morning," he said, voice firm but detached. "I'm the flight supervisor. We're trying to accommodate our VIP guest. We'd appreciate your cooperation in relocating your seat to avoid any disruption to the flight." Celeste set her laptop down and closed it carefully. "Let me get this straight," she replied. "I'm a platinum member. I reserved seat 2A, and I'm being asked to move because another passenger simply likes this seat more than I do?" Tony exhaled. "I understand this is unfortunate, but we can offer you another business class seat or a complimentary premium meal if you're willing to change seats." "I don't need a meal," Celeste cut in. "What I need is respect." Tony's gaze sharpened, his patience clearly thinning. "If you refuse to move, I'll have to escalate this to the captain. And if necessary, security may be involved." Each word landed like a silent blade, not because Celeste was afraid, but because she recognized this tone all too well. This wasn't new. From growing up in a struggling black neighborhood, to her college days, to launching her own company, she'd been here before. Always expected to keep the peace. Always asked to yield. Always told, it's better not to make a scene. But not this time. She calmly reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out her phone, and turned on the camera. She placed it on her lap, recording everything, image and sound. "Say that again, please," she said slowly, clearly. "I'm being removed from the seat I legally paid for, not because I broke any rule, but because someone else simply wants it." Tony said nothing. He turned away. Just a few rows behind, Renee, a young woman in seat 2C, was holding up her own phone, silently recording. She didn't speak. She didn't interfere. She just pressed record, again and again. No one knew then, not even Celeste, that these recordings would soon spread across social media, news channels, and eventually reach the boardroom of Novajet Airlines. What would you do if you witnessed that moment? If you were Celeste, how would you respond? Have you ever been treated unfairly just because of how you look or the color of your skin? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below, because this story isn't just about one person. It's about all of us. Celeste was never one to seek conflict. She believed that real strength didn't always speak loudly. Sometimes, dignity whispers louder than a storm ever could. She remained seated, upright, composed, unshaken. Her laptop sat neatly on the tray table before her, her phone resting silently on her lap, still recording. Not a single harsh word, not a glare, just a calm, unwavering gaze fixed on Flight Supervisor Tony Harris. "I paid for this seat," Celeste said, her voice low but crystal clear. "I'm a priority member. I have a ticket that clearly shows seat 2A, and I'm not going anywhere." Tony straightened his posture. The silence between them stretched tight, like a wire ready to snap. Behind him, flight attendant Lisa, who had just tucked the folded cash from Samantha into her uniform pocket, averted her eyes. She busied herself with the overhead bins, pretending that if she didn't see Celeste, none of this was really happening. But the passengers were watching now. Their curiosity had turned to discomfort. A middle-aged man frowned. A young woman slowly shook her head. "Either you move," Tony said, lowering his voice, "or we will be forced to remove you from the aircraft." Celeste didn't flinch. The threat wasn't shouted. It was tucked carefully into the rhythm of Tony's words, hidden in the steel of his tone, masked by the professional uniform of an industry that, in that moment, was working against her. "You're disrupting everyone," Tony added. "This is an important flight. If you don't cooperate, you're delaying other passengers." Celeste turned to him. "I'm not disrupting anything," she replied calmly. "I'm sitting in the seat I paid for. Nothing more, nothing less." Her voice didn't rise, it didn't tremble, and because of that, it filled the cabin more than any shouting ever could. Renee, seated nearby and still quietly recording, couldn't help but murmur, "She's not doing anything wrong." Tony heard it. He ignored it. "We can reassign you to another seat," he offered. "Upgrade your meal. Even refund this segment of your trip if necessary." Celeste looked up, her eyes sharp enough to cut through the polite veneer of his offer. "So what you're offering," she asked, "is for me to sell my dignity? For a meal and a different seat?" Tony sighed and looked away briefly. But when he turned back, his tone had chilled. "We can do this the easy way, or the hard way." It was a quiet sentence, but heavy with pressure, with power, with the weight of too many voices just like his, speaking to too many people just like her. One viewer later commented on the original video, "When Trevor said, 'We can do this the easy way or the hard way,' that's exactly the kind of subtle intimidation so many people face every day." At Black Excellence 365. Because the truth is this: injustice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it whispers, sometimes it hides behind what's best for everyone. Celeste knew this, she had lived this, but today, she wasn't going to let it pass quietly. "What you call easy," she replied, "is often easy for the powerful and costly for the one being asked to shrink." Tony paused, momentarily stunned. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a black woman. Small in stature, calm in tone, someone he'd assumed would comply. Lisa stepped forward, trying to de-escalate. "Miss Howard, I understand this is inconvenient. We're just trying to accommodate one of our loyal passengers." Celeste turned her head toward her. "You're trying to please one person by humiliating another?" Lisa fell silent. Her eyes dropped. The cabin grew heavy with tension. No one said a word, but no one looked away either. A white woman had been favored for being familiar. A black woman was being pressured to leave, despite having done nothing wrong. And once again, the story played out, just like it had in banks and offices and airports and on sidewalks. But this time there was a camera. This time, there were witnesses. And this time, someone refused to look down. As one viewer later wrote, "Marcus didn't just claim his seat, he claimed his dignity." At Voices Unheard. Today, Celeste did the same. She wasn't defending a seat, she was defending something much deeper. Her right to be seen, to be respected, to not be asked to disappear for the comfort of others. Tony, realizing the situation was spiraling, reached for the internal phone. "I'm calling the captain," he muttered, then walked briskly toward the front of the cabin. And as he left, Celeste remained still. Her gaze steady, her spine unbowed. She knew what was happening was bigger than her. She was sitting for every person who'd ever been told to give up their space, who'd been asked to move, to blend in, to be less inconvenient, not just on planes, but in classrooms, in meetings, in hospitals, in everyday life. This time, she stayed. And because she did, the world would watch. A black man seated nearby leaned toward his wife and whispered, "I've been through this before. They call you disruptive just for asking for what's yours." Renee was still recording. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anger. Anger at how familiar this was. Anger at herself, for the time she had stayed silent. But not today. Today, she wasn't going to look away. Tony returned. Behind him walked the captain, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, his expression tight with tension. They approached Celeste, and right there in plain view of every first-class passenger, this cabin became something else. A courtroom without walls, a stage for truth or erasure. Would dignity be preserved or quietly dismissed? What do you feel when you witness something like this? How should Celeste respond? And if you were sitting nearby, whose side would you be on? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Even a single word, justice, or a brief, "This happened to me too," could become a spark for someone else's courage. Up ahead, the cockpit door opened. Captain Michael Grant stepped into the cabin, a veteran of thousands of safe flights over the past 3 decades. He scanned the first-class aisle until his eyes landed on Celeste. Tony leaned in and whispered to him, while Lisa drifted quietly to the side. Samantha remained in the aisle, hand on her designer bag, her expression calm, as if everything was unfolding just the way she had expected. The captain turned to Celeste and addressed her with practiced authority. "Ma'am," he said, We've been informed that you are refusing to cooperate with the crew regarding your seat assignment. Please understand, in such cases, the crew's decisions are final, for the comfort and safety of all passengers." Celeste looked him directly in the eyes. Her voice was even, her words etched into the thick air that filled the cabin. "I am not being disruptive," she said. "I'm sitting in the seat I purchased, as confirmed on my boarding pass. I violated no rules. I'm not intruding on anyone's space. I'm simply refusing to surrender what I rightfully paid for, because someone else usually sits here." The captain frowned slightly and turned to Tony. "Has she broken any policy?" he asked. Tony answered quickly, "We're just trying to keep the peace." The other guest expressed dissatisfaction, and so, "No policy violation?" Celeste cut in, her voice low but firm. "No violation," she said louder this time. "Just prejudice." In seat 2C, Renee lifted her phone slightly higher. She had recorded everything, from Lisa slipping the cash into her pocket to Tony's veiled threats, and now the captain's growing discomfort. There was no shouting in this footage, no physical struggle. Just one woman holding her ground, and a system trying to gently, legally, quietly erase her. Captain Grant exhaled slowly. "Ma'am," he said, "it is my duty to ensure all passengers are treated appropriately. But if you won't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to request airport security to escort you off the aircraft." A stunned silence fell across first class. Someone whispered, "What is happening right now?" Celeste said nothing. She simply placed her laptop into her bag, folded her phone, and pulled her boarding pass from her coat pocket. Then she turned the camera to face her and spoke directly into the lens. "My name is Celeste Howard. I'm being removed from my first-class seat, a seat I paid for and was assigned, because a white passenger who usually sits here wanted it instead. Despite my priority status, despite having full documentation, I have done nothing wrong, and yet, I'm being asked to leave." As she finished, 2 uniformed security officers entered the cabin. "Ma'am," one said, "we've been asked to assist you off the plane." "On what grounds?" Celeste asked. "Disruption," the officer replied, checking a note on his device, "as reported by the flight crew." Celeste looked him in the eyes. "Do you have evidence that I was disruptive?" The officers exchanged a glance. One of them hesitated. "We're just following the captain's and supervisor's instructions." Celeste stood. She gathered her belongings. Every movement was deliberate, precise, no yelling, no scene. But her eyes, her posture, her stillness made the air in the cabin feel impossibly heavy. From somewhere behind, a passenger spoke out. "She didn't do anything wrong." Another voice followed. "I'm recording everything. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about something millions have felt but few dared to name." And that day, Celeste gave it a name. She gave it a voice. And the world would hear it. The fallout, a voice that echoed far beyond the cabin. Renee stood up, her voice trembling, but resolute. "I'm going with you," she said to Celeste. "I can't let this get buried like it never happened." And then, in front of everyone, Celeste slowly walked off the plane, her back straight, her chin held high, no tears, no anger, just dignity, unshaken. 30 minutes later, in a quiet airport lounge, Celeste sat alone. The sun now glared through the tall windows. She opened her phone. Messages were flooding in. Elise, her assistant. "What's going on? Your name is being tagged everywhere." "Celeste, the video is going viral. It's being reposted on Twitter. Views are skyrocketing." And then one more, this time from Renee. "I sent you the full video. Everything. Lisa taking the money, Tony's threats, and when you were escorted off. I'll testify if needed." Celeste exhaled. But it wasn't exhaustion. It was clarity. This was no longer personal. She tapped the voice recorder on her phone. "Send this to legal and to comms. Initiate a full internal review of our pending partnership with Novajet Airlines and cancel all ongoing negotiations." At the Novajet Airlines headquarters, 29 floors above street level, inside a gleaming glass tower, CEO Richard Wexley was finishing a late breakfast when a junior executive burst into the room, pale. "Mr. Wexley, we've got a major problem." He looked up. "What kind of problem?" "There's a video. It's gone viral. We're being accused of removing a black passenger from first class. It's all on camera, clear as day, including footage of our employee accepting money from another passenger." Wexley frowned. "Handle it internally. Release the standard statement." "We can't," the assistant stammered. "The passenger was Celeste Howard, CEO of Ethical Mind. She holds almost 24% of our shares." The room froze. Wexley set his coffee down slowly. "You said Celeste Howard?" "Yes, sir." It took a long moment before he murmured, "We just dismantled an entire alliance with our own hands." Within 2 hours, the video had spread across every platform: Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube. Each repost carried the same simple caption. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood up and held on to her dignity. Thousands of comments poured in, but in between the outrage and disbelief were quiet, powerful lessons. This is why you never judge a person by their appearance. If you think you hold power, remember, someone is always recording. Money doesn't buy justice, not when you're up against someone like Celeste. I showed this to my daughter and said, "This is how you hold your ground," without shouting. A lesson for everyone who's ever mistaken silence for weakness. Celeste didn't rush to respond. No press conference, no open letter. But every step she took, from quietly exiting the plane to submitting evidence to her legal team, was a message in itself. A voice that didn't need volume. A voice that carried more weight than 1,000 angry posts. And you? Have you ever been Celeste? Pushed out of the seat you paid for simply because someone thought you didn't belong? Or maybe you were Renee, finally deciding to stand up, even if you couldn't speak? Or perhaps you were a silent witness, watching injustice and saying nothing. You can write a few words in the comments below, even something simple like, "I saw, I understand, I'll remember this." Leave a thought, a lesson, a reflection, because someone, somewhere, might learn something because of you. The truth, if left unspoken, fades away. But when we light it together, it can illuminate an entire system. 29th floor Novajet Airlines HQ. CEO Richard Wexley stood frozen in the middle of the boardroom, the LED lights humming above him. In his hand was an iPad. On its screen, the now infamous video playing. Lisa, the flight attendant, taking cash from Samantha. Tony Harris, the supervisor, delivering his threat with chilling calm. And finally, Celeste, being escorted off the plane. Quiet, but full of quiet power. The sound from the video was heartbreakingly clear. "I wasn't wrong. I just refused to give up something I paid for, because someone else decided they deserved it more." Wexley turned off the video. The boardroom fell into an eerie silence. 8 senior executives exchanged glances, some frowning, others pressing their lips into thin lines. No one spoke. No one dared. The legal director cleared his throat. "Sir, do you realize Celeste Howard isn't just a platinum customer? She's the lead negotiator representing Ethical Mind in our $72 million partnership." The communications chief added, voice tense, "She's also our largest individual shareholder. 24%. If she pulls out, our stock will crash." Wexley's voice rasped. "Has this gone to the press?" The PR manager pointed toward the big screen. BuzzFeed, CNN, Bloomberg, Vox, over 18 global outlets have picked it up. The hashtag Justice for Celeste is trending #1 worldwide. Just then, the office phone rang. The caller ID read, "Celeste Howard, Ethical Mind HQ." Wexley hesitated before pressing the speaker button. "Miss Howard, no need for introductions." Celeste's voice cut through, sharp and steady. "I'm calling for an emergency shareholder meeting, 3 hours from now. This situation is explainable. It's negotiable. We can—" "This isn't the time for negotiation," she interrupted. "I was publicly humiliated on a flight, on an airline I partly own. I was forced out of my paid seat because of my skin color, while the other passenger was protected because she was familiar." The line went quiet. "I'm not calling for an apology," she continued. "I'm calling for action. 3 conditions. Immediate termination of all involved personnel. The $72 million deal with Ethical Mind is on hold, and I withdraw my stake unless decisive steps are taken immediately." Wexley swallowed hard. "Are you sure? You want to escalate things this far?" "I didn't escalate anything," Celeste replied. "You dragged this entire company down through silence and compromise with injustice." 30 minutes later, the emergency shareholder meeting began. Board members trickled in. Shirts wrinkled, ties askew, some clearly caught mid-commute in the rain. No one fully understood what they were walking into, but Wexley's grim expression said it all. When Celeste walked in, no one stood. Not out of disrespect, but because her presence carried a silent weight they hadn't expected. She didn't need to assert power. Her calmness spoke volumes. On the screen behind her, the video played again, this time in slow motion. Lisa accepting the money with a nervous smile. Tony saying, "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Celeste's unwavering gaze never flinching, and finally her walking off the plane, head held high. The video ended. The room stayed still for 40 seconds. The CFO removed his glasses and wiped the lenses despite no visible smudge. Celeste placed a folder on the table. "I want the entire flight crew involved. Terminated. This is non-negotiable." Wexley nodded at his assistant, who quickly sent the necessary messages. 5 minutes later, the HR director entered the room. "We've summoned Tony Harris, Lisa, and Captain Grant to HR. Termination letters are prepared." A board member leaned forward. "Are you still pulling out of the $72 million contract?" "Yes," Celeste answered firmly, "because you haven't heard enough to learn anything." A wave of tension passed through the room. "I don't do business with systems that only respond when caught. If you really want change, don't just adjust payrolls, adjust your mindset." At the HR department, ground floor, Tony Harris, still in uniform, sat across from the director. Lisa and Captain Grant sat beside him, all wordless. The video played again on a screen. As Samantha was seen slipping money into Lisa's pocket, her hands trembled. Tony dropped his eyes. Captain Grant shut his eyes tight, as if trying to block out the shame. "We had no choice," Tony murmured. "We were just following the VIP's request." "And because of that," the HR director replied, "you compromised the trust of millions of passengers." "We didn't know who she was," Lisa whispered. "Which makes it worse," the HR director said coldly. "Because it proves this wasn't about who she was. It proves anyone without power can be discarded, and no one would defend them." There was no need for signatures. 3 white envelopes sat on the desk. Contracts terminated, effective immediately. Within 12 hours, the hashtag Justice for Celeste surpassed 25 million mentions. At airports across the country, passengers shared the video, debated, reflected. News outlets called it the event that redefined customer service standards in aviation. And beneath the video, the comments grew more profound. "I'm showing this to my students and asking, what makes a person truly valuable? You don't need power to be respected. You just need to hold fast to what you believe in." This isn't just about Celeste. It's about all of us, those who were told they didn't fit the seat. 1 week later, Novajet Airlines issued a public statement. 1. A formal press conference to apologize to Celeste Howard and the broader community. 2. Establishment of an internal equity and bias response center. 3. Mandatory 48-hour training for every employee before returning to work. 4. A new zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, regardless of how subtle. During the press conference, Celeste stood on stage beside CEO Richard Wexley. Not as a victim, but as a force of redirection. She said just one thing: you don't need to shout to be heard, but you must never stay silent when you know something is wrong. And what about you? If you were Celeste, would you rise, even knowing it would isolate you? If you were Renee, would you dare to record, to speak, to risk something for the truth? If you were Tony, would you follow procedure or your conscience? If you sat next to Celeste, would you act or stay quiet like most? Let us know in the comments below. If you were in their shoes, what would you do? We don't need a perfect story. We need the truth from your heart, because every single comment might be a lesson for someone reading. And maybe, just maybe, it'll help someone out there be brave enough to hold their place, not just on a plane, but in this life. 3 white envelopes. 3 revoked ID badges. 3 pairs of eyes, no longer filled with confidence but confusion, and maybe even regret. That evening, Tony Harris, Lisa, and Captain Michael Grant walked out of Novajet Airlines headquarters. Their hands clutched small boxes of personal belongings. The employee badges they once wore with pride now deactivated. The automatic glass doors slid shut behind them, coldly, indifferently. Just like they once shut down compassion for a woman who simply didn't look familiar enough. No one came to see them off. No formal handshake. No farewell speech. Only the long shadow of sunset on the sidewalk and quiet glances from distant employees. Some relieved, others lowering their eyes in silence. Tony Harris, once a respected first-class flight supervisor with 12 years of experience, now sat in a 4th-floor apartment in Queens, sending out resumes to airlines one by one. Each email came back with the same line: "Thank you for your interest, but we've selected another candidate." At first, Tony told himself, maybe they saw the video, but I didn't do anything that wrong. But one night, unable to sleep, he watched the clip again. The moment where his eyes, cold, dismissive, stared down at Celeste, not like a service provider, but like a judge deciding someone's worth. When he heard himself say, "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," Tony's chest tightened. He had once heard those exact words from a cop when he was 17, stopped just for looking out of place in a suburban neighborhood. That night, he'd stayed quiet, didn't argue, and made it home, humiliated, but safe. And yet, here he was, years later, a black man, using the same tone against someone who looked just like him. He didn't cry because he lost his job. He cried because he'd lost something bigger. His conscience. Lisa, the flight attendant once praised for remembering every VIP's name, now lived with her elderly mother in a small apartment in Newark. Her mother's pension barely covered their bills. Lisa was still unemployed, and her resume now carried a silent stain. "Why did you leave NovaJet?" The video didn't show the exact moment she accepted the money, but recruiters had seen enough. They didn't need to ask. Their eyes said it all. "We don't hire people who can be bought." Lisa had told herself it was just a small compromise for a regular client, but now she understood. Every small wrong choice is a brick that chips away at the foundation of your ethics. One evening, as she sat in the bathroom removing her chipped nail polish, her mother entered quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I saw the video, sweetheart. You don't have to explain. But if you feel shame, then let the rest of your life be the way you make it right." Lisa didn't speak, but for the first time in weeks, she wept in her mother's arms, not as a fired employee, but as a grown woman, relearning the lesson of right and wrong. Captain Michael Grant, once awarded a medal for safely landing a failing aircraft 5 years earlier, couldn't even land a job now, not even as a ground supervisor. His resume was too heavy with prestige, but too light on integrity, at least in the eyes of the public, after that viral video. He lived alone. His wife had passed from cancer years ago. These days, he took morning walks to a nearby park, sat on a bench, and watched planes sweep across the sky. One rainy morning, he called an old friend, a retired pilot. His voice cracked slightly as he said, "I used to teach young pilots that in the air, there's no room for mistakes. But down here, I forgot that rule. I didn't stand for what was right, and I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life." Samantha, the elegant woman used to being served like royalty, didn't escape consequences either. She wasn't fired, at least not immediately. But the footage of her handing cash to a flight attendant spread like wildfire. She was suspended from the board of the investment firm where she served. Luxury brands that once sponsored her quietly severed ties. Her name became a trending cautionary tale, a living reminder of unchecked privilege and public disgrace. On forums and discussion boards, people wrote, "You can be rich, you can be famous, but if you lose your character, you become nothing more than a warning story." And Celeste Howard? She didn't celebrate, didn't write a dramatic post, didn't attack anyone by name. She simply went back to work, back to helping companies see the hidden biases in their systems, back to building software that restores fairness, back to being the quiet voice that changes everything. But in a private workshop weeks later, someone asked, "Do you forgive them?" Celeste smiled. "Forgiveness is something I do for myself, but earning back trust, that takes more than time. It takes action." 3 months later, NovaJet Airlines announced an unprecedented policy in the aviation industry, a bias-free customer response protocol, designed by Ethical Mind. At the same time, the airline launched a new program called Second Flight, a retraining initiative for employees who had previously violated ethical standards, but were willing to take responsibility and grow. No one was forced to return, but Tony, Lisa, and Michael, all three, signed up, not to reclaim old jobs, but to face themselves. At the first session, Celeste showed up. She wasn't in a power suit. She was just a facilitator, standing in a white room, her eyes clear, not accusing, but not offering leniency either. "We're not here to apologize," she began. "We're here to learn how not to repeat the same mistakes." She played the video again, but this time, she paused at certain frames. Here, whose gaze diminished someone's worth? At second 13, did anyone say, "Stop, this isn't right"? How many of us have stayed silent in the face of injustice just to avoid trouble? The room was silent, but this time no one looked away. And now we want to ask you, the person watching this video, if you were Lisa, would you have refused the money and said, "I'm sorry, this seat belongs to her"? If you were Tony, would you have stood up and said, "We don't remove passengers with valid tickets"? If you were Captain Grant, would you have asked, "Who's really causing disruption here?" instead of repeating the report? And if you were just a nearby passenger, would you have spoken up? We want to hear your answer in the comments. You don't have to write a long story, even one sentence like, "I've stayed silent before, and I don't want to do it again," or "I choose to stand for what's right, even if I have to stand alone." Because even one voice can be the spark that helps someone else find the courage to do the right thing on a day when no one else dares. The sky that day was overcast, but no storm came. A warm, gentle light spread across the glass building of Ethical Mind, where Celeste Howard hosted the final workshop of the second flight program. There were no media cameras, no trending hashtags, no frantic typing from reporters. Only people, sitting in a circle, quietly facing each other, and more importantly, facing themselves. Tony Harris wore a white shirt for the first time since leaving Novajet. Not to impress, but to start again, with intention. When he arrived, he saw Lisa already seated, clutching a small notepad. Captain Grant was also present, wearing a simple wool sweater, his fingers still turning his old wedding ring, as if seeking steadiness in something familiar. Celeste entered last, no podium. She simply sat among them, her face calm, her gaze softer now, like a lamp glowing in a rainy night. "Thank you all for being here," she said. "We're not here just to apologize. We're here to understand what forgiveness truly means. And it's not just about forgiving others. It's learning how to forgive yourself." That day, Celeste shared a story. "When I was 12, my father was kicked out of a parent-teacher conference because they thought he was a delivery man who'd wandered into the wrong room. He didn't argue. He just held my hand, walked me out, bought me a sandwich, and said, 'Never let anyone define your worth, just because they don't understand who you are.'" She paused, then continued slowly. "Back then I didn't understand why he didn't fight back. Now I do. He wasn't being silent, he was choosing to respond with dignity, not anger." Tony nodded, his eyes red. Lisa whispered, "I never thought I could be forgiven, but hearing you speak, I realize I never learned how to forgive myself." Rebuilding doesn't begin with PR campaigns. It begins with honest, small conversations, with no hiding. Novajet is no longer the airline it once was. But for the first time, it became an airline brave enough to look in the mirror and say, "We were wrong." The entire system was rewritten, from seat assignment procedures to passenger grievance handling to even hiring standards, now focusing on empathy, not just experience. Ethical Mind was brought in as a long-term consulting partner, and while Celeste kept a professional distance, she didn't walk away, because she understood. True change often needs someone who's been hurt deeply, to lead with compassion, not revenge. On Novajet's official website, a new message now appears in bold. "We don't promise we'll never make mistakes, but we do promise we won't repeat the same ones, and we will always listen with heart." After the final training session, as everyone stood to leave, Celeste gently called Lisa back. "That day," she said softly, "you remained silent. But today you spoke the words many people never find the courage to say. I know I was wrong, and I'm learning to do what's right." Lisa nodded, her voice trembling. "I used to think I was just a small part of a big system. But now I see, it's the small parts that make up the whole." She held out her hand. "I don't expect to be forgotten. I only hope to begin again, better this time." Celeste shook her hand. She didn't say anything more. Because forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about giving someone the chance to be seen again, through eyes that no longer judge. 3 months later, at an international airport, an elderly passenger struggled with a broken seat assignment. A young flight attendant, instead of quoting company policy, calmly changed the seat for him and gently said, "We're here to serve, not to decide who deserves what." The passenger smiled. He didn't know it, but that line came directly from Novajet's new crew handbook. A quiet legacy of what had once gone wrong and been made right. On board, no one was looked at as unfamiliar. Regardless of skin color, profession, or title, everyone was offered tea the same way, greeted with the same warmth. 1 month later, Celeste received a handwritten letter, a rarity in the age of email. It was from Tony Harris. "I don't know if I'll ever work in aviation again, but I do know this. If I ever meet a passenger like you again, I will be the first to say, no one has the right to take away a seat you paid for, with dignity and kindness. Thank you for not humiliating me, but making me reflect, so that when I walked out that door, I was no longer the same man who walked in." Forgiveness doesn't begin when someone begs for it. It begins when someone dares to face their own darkness and chooses not to look away. And you? The one watching this video right now, have you ever forgiven yourself? Have you ever been the one who stayed silent and regretted it? Or have you ever been judged unfairly, simply because you didn't look like everyone else? Would you, like Celeste, stay calm and quiet instead of screaming? Would you, like Lisa, find the courage to publicly admit your mistake? Please share in the comments below. What is the biggest thing you learned from this story? It might be a full paragraph, it might be just a sentence, it might be 3 words, "Now I understand." But every comment is part of the healing, not just for Novajet, but for all of us who've sometimes judged someone with just a glance. A Boeing 787 with its new slogan, Novajet, "Fly with integrity," rolled gently onto runway 6 one crisp autumn morning as the sun began to rise over the eastern horizon. On board, the air was calm and warm. Flight attendants smiled at every guest. No one was favored for being familiar. No one was forgotten for dressing plainly. Celeste Howard wasn't on that flight, but she was the one who had written the new line now printed in italics in every crew handbook. "We don't just serve people, we serve human dignity." Every ticket holds a story. Every passenger is a world. Don't ask who they are. Ask yourself, have I looked at them with fairness? Novajet's transformation didn't come from market pressure. It came from an awakening of conscience. Not everyone forgives easily. Not everyone returns to the place where they once failed. But Lisa, the flight attendant who once took a bribe and looked away, is now the one training new crew members, retelling her story as a living lesson. She doesn't sugarcoat the past. She doesn't blame others. She simply says, "That was the day I made the wrong choice. But the very passenger I failed to protect taught me what it truly means to stand for someone, even when they're no longer in front of you." Tony Harris, after countless rejections, now works in Novajet's customer support department, not making decisions, but being the first person to listen. In an interview when asked, "Would you go back in time to fix your mistake?" Tony smiled. "I don't need to go back, because the wrong I did, I've faced it, and what I do today is the most lasting apology I can offer." And perhaps most surprising of all, Captain Michael Grant, once viewed as a symbol of failure, has returned to the skies. But not in a cockpit. Instead, he now travels to elementary schools, teaching children about responsibility, integrity, and why every decision in the air must start from a place of human decency on the ground. When invited to return to flying commercial planes, he declined. "I've flown thousands of hours," he said, "but now I want to help others fly in the right direction, from the heart." And what about Samantha, the woman who once believed money could buy everything? No one knows for sure. After being suspended from every board position she held, she disappeared from social media. But months later, at a quiet seminar for professionals seeking redemption after ethical misconduct, someone spotted a woman with neatly tied hair sitting silently in the front row, listening intently. No one confirmed it was Samantha. But if it truly was her, then perhaps in that silence, a new journey had quietly begun. The story of Celeste Howard is no longer just a scandal, no longer just a viral video. It has become a value, taught in corporate training sessions across the country, featured in high school ethics classes under one powerful question: what would you do if injustice unfolded right in front of you? One day at a closed conference, Celeste was asked, "Do you ever regret standing up that day? You could have stayed quiet, had a smooth flight, and still kept everything." She paused, then answered, "If I had stayed quiet that day, maybe I would have been fine. But someday, a child might board a plane, be told to give up their seat, and believe they deserve to be treated that way. I didn't stand up for myself. I stood up so others wouldn't have to endure in silence the way I once did. 1 year later, Celeste sat in a quiet airport lounge in Portland. No one recognized her, no greetings, no fanfare, and she didn't expect any. A young flight attendant approached and bowed slightly. "Hi ma'am, we have a seat with more legroom available. Would you like to move? As a priority guest, it's yours if you'd like." Celeste looked at the young woman, eyes clear, tone respectful, and smiled. "No need, but thank you for asking. That already tells me things are changing." The attendant nodded, not fully understanding, but smiling back, and walked away. That flight took off on time. No one was asked to leave their seat. No one was questioned. "Are you sure you belong in first class?" No one stood above anyone else, except the captain, and that's because he was in the cockpit. A new airline took flight that day, not by repainting logos but by changing the way it saw people. And you, watching this right now, if you've ever been misjudged, would you stand up and redefine your worth? If you've ever been in the wrong, would you begin the journey of making it right, not to erase your past but to honor your future? If you've ever stayed silent, would you now speak up for someone who needs to hear that they matter? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What did you take away from this journey? Or simply write, "I choose to fly with fairness. I choose to listen. I choose not to turn away." Because every comment is a kind of ticket, not a boarding pass, but a ticket into a better world, where everyone sits in the place they deserve, and no one gets pushed out simply because they don't look like first class. This story ends here. But the journey of justice, healing, and humanity continues. On every flight, in every glance, and deep within your own heart. If you've ever been looked at with suspicion because of your skin color, undervalued because of your gender, or dismissed because your appearance didn't fit the mold, you are not alone. We are here to listen. And there are thousands of others who've walked through pain just like you. Share your story in the comments. Maybe it's just one sentence, but perhaps that one sentence is the light someone else needs to feel seen. If what you just watched touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, because we'll keep telling stories like this, stories of justice, empathy, and healing, for you, for us, for everyone who's ever felt out of place in a world that wasn't built for fairness. Justice isn't a slogan, it's something we build together. Through every glance, every small act, every kind word. Thank you for staying until the end. We'll see you in the next story, where fairness isn't a dream, but a choice we make every single day.